morning, everyone. I'm Justin. I'm one of the pastors employed here, but only one of many priests here today. Many who I know are gifted, called, and who do the good work of pastoring in a variety of contexts. So thanks to everyone here who, in your own way and in your own times, do the important work of pastoring and imaging God to the world in your home, in your workplaces, in schools, and many more. It's always a vital reminder that the one who preaches on Sunday is just one of many who are doing the good work. So here's to all of you who do it without the title. We're gathered here today on the third Sunday of Advent. The theme is joy. We've talked about hope and peace the last couple of weeks. Next, we'll talk about love. But this week, we are on joy. I don't know what Advent has been like for you in your life, but for me, sometimes I've wondered, okay, am I just supposed to manufacture these feelings the week that they arrive? What if I'm not feeling very hopeful or peaceful or joyful? What then? I think there's space for that here this morning, that honesty. So know that whatever you're feeling right now or at any given point this Advent, God can and will meet you there. There's no need to manufacture feelings. After all, the wonder of the season begins the moment all our rituals, all our symbolic acts, and all our routines give way to the discovery and the reminder that God is with us. That's the deep truth of the incarnation and the Christmas story, and in fact, the entire biblical story. From garden to tabernacle to temple and beyond. Jesus was not the plan B of a failed system, but the ongoing work of a creator that has always sought nearness with creation. The continued act of God offering the fullness of God's own life through closest possible relationship found in completion in Christ, as someone much smarter than me once said. So welcome here to the third week of Advent as we near Christmas. I hope all your preparations, your expectations, and your hopes find a voice in this anticipatory time. Because after all, these times, they are anticipatory. There's a lot to long for, not only each of us as individuals, but for communities all around the world. All around us, many are struggling for things like food or shelter, right? And the chaos of this ongoing economic crises, or for revival and a more just transition and the overwhelming environmental crisis, or simply for the possibility of life under war and occupation when homes are taken, when people are sectioned off, and the bombs come crashing. Now, of course, the most critical and apparent situation lately has been that happening in the Middle East, and one thing I've been particularly struck by this past week or so are the actions of one of Mennonite Church Canada's international witness partners, Palestinian pastor Munther Isaac of Bethlehem Bible College, who set up a nativity scene in his church a couple weeks ago, displaying baby Jesus situated in the debris of a destroyed building. And Pastor Isaac says, if Jesus were born today, he would be born in Gaza under rubble. If that isn't striking for Christians around the globe, I don't know what else might be said. But that's exactly it. Here we are today, gathered at the crossroads of our everyday lives and our everyday hopes, asking how might all these things come together to make sense. We have Advent and joy and war and Jesus Christ, but a lot of us are just everyday people, right? We're trying to make it work. Some of us are overwhelmed enough trying to make ends meet, schedules fit, tests, jobs, managing our relationships, our health, trying to survive, nevertheless mind some of these international catastrophes that often escape our understanding. How and why can we be expected to make sense of all these things when so many of us I know are just getting by? Well, folks, at risk of sounding like one of those insufferable pastors that just bangs a Bible over everyone's head and says it's the answer to absolutely everything, I'm going to propose that one of the answers to this question of how and why we can and should be expected to make sense of these things might just be the Bible. Certainly more than the Bible alone, but absolutely no less. If the Bible is indeed the lowercase w Word of God, if it is indeed inspired and authoritative as we claim, if it is indeed somehow still worth reading despite being thousands of years old and having gone through major processes of writing and editing and translating and canonizing and debating and studying, we're going to have to ask, to what end and for whose benefit? The Mennonite Church Confession says we believe God continues to speak through the living and written word for teaching, for guiding, and discerning. It is essential, and we commit in its reading, studying, and meditating to discover what God is saying in our time. So if the confession is going to be our confession, then it's got to have life. It's got to have relevance in our community. So let's do it. It says, see how the Bible continues to speak and how it might stir or encourage us this morning, or maybe confront and challenge, to ultimately ask, how might it move us towards becoming a more loving, hopeful, just, and joyful community this Advent season? So you with me? Let's take a plunge. Today we are in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, verses 1 to 7. 7 verses that on the surface seem to be that old familiar Christmas story once again. Oh boy, how many times have any of us here seen this, right? I think this church is about 40 years old, right? That's a symbolic generation in a Bible, so that means it's been about a full generation of engaging this story. That's a lot of annunciations, magnificats, magi, angels, and shepherds. That's a lot. I've watched Elf maybe a dozen times, and I'm already like, it's about 11 times too many. Let's watch something else. But a generation of Christmases, a generation of gospel narratives, and I guess there's only 2 gospels which have the story anyway, so that is a lot of time getting familiar with Mary, Joseph, and Jesus through Matthew and Luke. What's going to make it any different this time around? Or maybe not. Maybe it's the opposite. Maybe the familiarity is precisely what you look for every Christmas. That's why you watch Elf every year, over and over and over and over and over again. Either way, I guess this brings us back once again to that dynamic of something old and something new, of taking what was and making it come alive again in a new way, from Exodus to Deuteronomy in September to the vine and the branches in November, and now the Christmas story in December. That question of, does this still speak, and if so, how? That is once again at the core of our task today, that junction between learned, unlearning, relearning. To the birth of Jesus, then, how are we Deuteronomizing today? Well, when I was studying the passage this past week, brought back lots of memories for me. I don't know about you, but I paid my dues growing up in my childhood church. At different points, if I remember right, I've played a lamb, an angel, a Scrooge, depending on the year, and I have lots of both fond and objectionable memories of watching whoever's job it was that particular Christmas, whichever uncle or auntie had the privilege or burden to put some sort of production on to tell the story once again. And while there was, maybe hopefully something a little bit different every year, There are always a few indispensable elements. I don't think they would be that different from what many of us in this room have experienced, right? Story usually goes Joseph and Mary, right, hurrying out of Nazareth. For some reason, it's always the middle of the night when they're traveling. There's always a donkey that Mary is on, and she's usually about 39.9 weeks pregnant. Two of them show up at Bethlehem and get turned away at every hotel because they're too full. And only when, and finally, as a last resort, an innkeeper takes pity on them that they get to settle in a barn somewhere where Mary gives birth, surrounded by animals. The point of the story usually goes something like, look at the urgency with which everything happened, look at the inhospitality, and look at how it all came together despite this hostile environment. Isn't it a miracle? In many ways, I'm grateful for the details in these versions of the story. They don't come out of thin air. They're based upon centuries of traditions, of paintings, of customs and lore that has been passed down for generation after generation, and they give life to the narrative. Part of the beauty of this faith is that heritage that you claim and that claims you. And it is that heritage that has functioned to bring to life the imaginations of all who have encountered the story of Jesus. I am very grateful for these things, both in the big picture sense of the legacy that I get to witness, and in the small picture sense in my personal experiences, learning the story this way, yes, even when I was forced into various costumes. But what was striking for me this time around, in Christmas 2023, is just how little there actually is in the Gospels. When you consider the massive amount of detail that has been poured into the birth of Jesus. Reading Luke for me this year, I was like, Christians have done a lot to fill in the blanks. Like I said, though, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Inherently, it's not necessarily a bad thing. But it can be when it, either dulls our sense of wonder to the story because it is just so familiar, or B, when it gets in the way of the text itself. When connecting the dots keeps us from seeing the dots. Overall, it just goes to show we all do our part in the art of interpretation. It's just a matter of whether or not we are aware of it. What is simple and clearly in the Bible may actually be quite complicated. And what is straightforward, everybody knows it, might be precisely what is getting in the way of what actually is. Approaching the story this year, let us not allow what has been learned to get in the way of our unlearning or our relearning. So what's happening here? Well, the story we're engaging today is a Lucan special. The details are found nowhere else but here. Matthew begins, here is Jesus' select lineage. Here's what happened to Joseph and the astrologers. Jesus was born, they fled to Egypt when Herod ordered the killings. Mark says, well, Mark doesn't say anything. And John, let's not even go there. He's a weirdo. Luke, though, spills all the tea. Tradition tells us Luke had access to Jesus' inner circle, maybe Mary herself. So Luke's telling of the story is very telling. He apparently has details the other three do not. So chapter 2, if you want to open your Bibles to there today, begins something like this. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus, son of a god, that all the empire should be registered, that a census should be taken of the entire world in the most literal sense. No sarcasm at all there from Luke. This was the first registration taken while Quirinius, may his name be cursed, was governed by Syria, or was governor of Syria. So all went to their own towns to be registered. Without care, this introduction is easily glossed over, my friends. When we rush too quickly to Jesus, we miss this vital framework Luke is giving us. It's like if I told you a story and I begun it. At that time, when Roosevelt and Churchill were communicating and the Nationalist Party was moving its way through Europe, you can't really think about the story any other way. Even if it were a story about, Jimmy's childhood in Lethbridge, everything still in their story would be conditioned by such an introduction. Or put another way, if I were to begin a book about the music industry, and I began it like it took place outside Radio City Music Hall in 2009, shortly after Kanye interrupted Taylor on stage at the VMAs, it would be really hard to tell that story without readers being like, oh, I remember that. Everything in that story might be conditioned by such an introduction. Or if you want something a little bit more neutral between the 40s and 2009, maybe I could simply ask, where were you and what do you remember that era that Neil took step on the moon for the first time? Or when Princess Diana got in her collision? Or when the first case of COVID was first identified in Vancouver? I'm sure as soon as I say all these things, a lot of things come to mind about a particular era, right? It's a feel, it's the music, it's the fashion, it's the political situations, right? These are all essential markers, for no story is complete without a culture, without a setting, without a frame of reference. And here Luke is doing what Luke does always so well, which is situate his story of the Son of God and the good news of Jesus within the times and the trials of this all-seeing, all-powerful empire of Rome. Scholars Barbara Reed and Shelley Matthews tell us, by linking Jesus' birth with the decree of a Roman emperor carried out by a local governor, Luke reminds us Jesus is born in a land where imperial might holds sway. Scholar Yusto Gonzalez echoes this, saying the setting of Luke is that of a people under an oppressive regime. The mentions of Augustus and Quirinius is politically charged. For a period before the Roman Empire, the Jews had been struggling against Syrian domination, and now their land was ruled from Syria by a governor appointed by Rome. To finish this, then, scholar Diane Chen says, setting the birth of Lord Jesus against the backdrop of Lord Augustus, Luke is making a bold theopolitical statement. In the first century, every proclamation of Jesus in royal and divine terms could be construed rebellion. So you see, peace, just 2 lines in today, and Luke's words are already oozing theology and politics, cluing any first century audience to the idea that if Jesus were truly with the people, Jesus would be with them in the muck of it. The depth of Jesus' incarnation means even as God is over and above and beyond, God is in and God is with in the concrete realities of this world. The good news of Jesus is not escape to some faraway land after death, but the deep transformation of our cosmos. That's why I'm always a little bit curious when people say church should just talk about spiritual things and stay out of issues and politics that affect people. Not only is it a modern thing to kind of distinguish these realms, it also ignores the very concrete realities and implications of a God who arrives specifically into the circumstances of everyday people. If you were a first century resident of ancient Palestine, listening to Luke for the first time, there would be no way that the loaded first two sentences would not have cried out to you. Something is happening. Caesar Augustus, a census. That name, those acts are not neutral. That's an overlord commanding an inventory of the wealth of your home. That census is for taxes and not so everyone can have better healthcare and schools. That's an exploitative deed that fueled war and was a painful reminder of subjugation and control, of a faraway tyrant who could, at their whim, obliterate us if we don't comply. Luke, as no stranger to the difficulty of the people and the times, names Augustus, names Quirinius precisely to remind his audiences for all time, Jesus was born unto occupation. But by the power and the timing of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who led the people out of Egypt, who organized the 12 tribes, who gave them the teachings, who established David, who promised an everlasting throne, who argued with, cried for, and hurt on behalf of the people when injustices were perpetuated on the land, when empires Assyria and Babylon and Persia rolled into town, even this time around, this empire led by Augustus named Rome, bigger than anything anyone had ever known yet, whose power was all-reaching, whose slogan Pax Romana disguised atrocities and conquering and subjugation, which boasted an everlasting kingdom, even this empire was now meeting its match. For in the birth of Jesus, Luke tells the world for all time that even Caesar ought to pay attention. Even Caesar, whose taxes brought the poorest down to their knees, was going to become an unwitting pawn. For this act of oppression was setting in motion the birth of the coming Lord of Lords. From here, Luke tells us Joseph went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth, to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because Joseph was of the house and family line of David. Joseph went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged and who was expecting. While there, the time came for her to deliver her child. And she gave birth to her firstborn, wrapped him in cloths, laid him in a manger, for there was no space where they were staying. From the big, grand, cosmic political situation, Luke zooms way in to the lives of two ordinary people. We today have venerated Mary and Joseph. We've built 2,000 years of theology on them. I got this. But back then, these two may as well have been two obscure moisture farmers on the fringes of a sparsely inhabited land on the outer rim. And it was here in this backwater colony that the beginnings of the empire's overthrow was about to begin. I'm going to donate this thing one day to another church, maybe an MB church. As I was saying earlier, this little bit here, part 2 of our text today, okay. As I was saying here, this little bit here, part 2 of our text today, while centuries of Christians have imagined up scenarios and side characters, ways to connect the dots, really when we read this, it's pretty bare bones. For all the creative interpretation that's been done, Luke really does not tell us much about how the whole thing went down. It's all quite matter of fact when you read it, actually. Luke tells us that Joe went with Mary from Nazareth to Bethlehem, which is about a 3-day hike, to partake in this empire-wide census. Luke tells us Joe was descended from David, so the place Joe was to register was Bethlehem, where if you read in the Old Testament, David was born and anointed. Luke tells us the baby was born. The baby was wrapped up, laid in a manger, because depending on which translation you have, either there was no room at the inn or no place in the guest room. Unlike popular portrayal here, there is no mad overnight dash, no donkey, no mean innkeepers, no barn, or at least not anything like we know a barn to be, no wooden troughs, just some rough details or a quick sketch of the birth. And that is really great, because it is here, in the silence of what is not said, that the Christmas story has come alive for centuries. I'll just note a few things here for us in 2023. First, many scholars don't think Joseph and Mary's journey was actually some sort of chaotic overnight run from Nazareth to Bethlehem. A last-minute thing where Joseph fails to make arrangements, and so there are no hotel rooms. Also, many scholars wonder whether Jesus' birth took place in a barn, again, like any sort of modern barn. A cave is possible, though we don't really know for sure. Either way, those details are filled in backwards from the bit about no room in the inn. Here's where it's really interesting, because today when we read a phrase like no room in the inn, it's easiest for us to think, well, room 101 to 125 and 201 to 225 are all full. So there is no room. Like there was a chain of Best Westerns or something in Bethlehem. So you'll notice more and more in translations today, at least in part because of this occurrence, that it's translated no space in the guest room. I think that gets more accurately, actually, to the heart of it. It gets us out of the familiar and into the unknown, so to speak. How so? Well, from Jesus' times, we know this. The first is homes today in North America are quite different, obviously, than the average home in first century Palestine. Homes 2,000 years ago in this place were often one big room with 2 levels, about 1 meter apart in height. There was a main upper room for the family and a lower, smaller room, usually for animals. That's why when Jesus says, go prepare an upper room, and they go to the upper room during the communion, it's called an upper room, because they're about 1 meter apart. If the family were better off, there might be a guest room, either on the roof or off to the side, where visitors could stay. This should be our first point of interest. The second thing is, in this time and place, hospitality was a serious concern, much more so than in our modern Western notions of hosting a dinner party. Hospitality was a posture offered to the stranger who needed help in a time where it wasn't like people were whipping around 100 miles an hour in the safety of a vehicle. Traveling was often dangerous. It was often slow, precarious, so that's why, at least in part, hospitality encompassed an entire culture. And that's why in the biblical stories, a breach of hospitality was so serious. It's like growing up in Edmonton for me. If you drove by someone on a highway in a minus 30 day, it's a serious offense. Sort of like that. Lastly, then, to bring it all together, it's also likely that Joseph had relatives in Bethlehem, his ancestral home. By relatives, I mean some sort of extended kin, not just like our modern Western notions of nuclear families. So considering all these things, the design of the homes, the hospitality culture, the likelihood of family, I hope it's not too controversial for me to say today that it was likely Joseph and Mary did have a place to stay. We don't know that for sure, but it's as good a guess as any. In all likelihood, Mary arrived a little while before she was due, and maybe they stayed with some sort of family. So why is there no room then? Well, think about it. In this poor peasant area of Rome, if indeed an empire-wide census was happening, you could probably guess people were moving around quite a bit. And that means a lot of moving pieces for families everywhere. Just imagine for yourself, if you were the host house for 20, 40, 60 relatives coming in and out through weeks or months, how would that go for you? Maybe I shouldn't bring that up, it's too stressful. But I'm sure many of you would do a great job hosting, but it would be a lot for absolutely any of us to be hosting that much family. And so you can see whatever their exact place of stay, whether in the guest room of a relative or at a stranger's house, Mary likely gave birth in the lower level of the home where the animals were kept, because at least maybe there might be some level of privacy. And whoever's house it was, it meant someone had gone out of their way to accept Mary and Joseph, who were expecting, into their home. So you see, maybe it's actually the exact opposite, maybe, of what tradition has passed down, even as we leave open the possibility that the traditional interpretations have truth too. Maybe then this story isn't about a lack of hospitality when considered this way, but one of hospitality. I don't want us to get lost in the weeds. I know I just gave a lot of information. But the point is this. A reading of Luke today shows us the basic truth that amid the oppression of the Roman Empire on the everyday lives in first century Palestine, in fact, the humble beginnings of God's empire was striking back. And as we have reinforced here many times before, God's way of striking back was always in the most unexpected ways. It wasn't some secret meeting to raise up an army somewhere. It wasn't a plan with society's rich and mighty plotting to stab Caesar again. It wasn't at the heart of metropolitan Rome where a charismatic, Brad Pitt-looking dude was learning how to wield a sword. No. It was a mom. It was a dad going about their business, living their lives, dependent upon others in an occupied land fraught with violence. It was here that God was bringing about a new world of shalom again. So this morning, as we contemplate how the story of the birth of Jesus still speaks, I hope we are able to connect the dots, not just in terms of interpreting the finer details of Jesus' birth 2,000 years ago, but in terms of the world today. God was at work bringing love, peace, justice, wholeness, flourishing, harmony, mutuality, prosperity, reconciliation, or shalom through the regular lives of people who were subject to the violence and exploitation of an occupying force in ancient Palestine. When I consider this story, together with the words of Pastor Munter Isaac, and the massive power differential of the current situation in modern Palestine, Advent looks and feels quite different, doesn't it? The joy that might come this third Sunday of Advent, if it is to be more than wishful thinking and dreaming, begins when we stop romanticizing these ancient stories and we interrogate for ourselves how they might still be at play today. If the Bible is to be anything more than a symbol of power or long-lost morality, then let us not look away from the power of empires which still exist today and the plight of the everyday person struggling against them. For you can bet that if you look close enough, what played out in the Bible 2,000 years ago is still playing out today in a new way. The Bible is the raw material of the old, and the building of the new is limited only by our imaginative engagement of it, by the Spirit and the community's guide. We already fill in the blanks with much of our reading, as we demonstrated today. The question is, will we fill in the blanks in new ways for those today displaced, exploited by a violent power? Jesus' story is still very much at play around the world in the stories of boys and girls in occupied lands. This Christmas, will we stick to our rituals for our rituals' sake? Or will our hospitality reverberate across time, across space, to strike back at our empires? Thanks. I invite the worship team back up.